All right, it's 8 a.m. We're ready to start. This is session 301 with Spencer W. McBride, Joseph Smith's presidential campaign and the quest for religious freedom. My name is Tana Lynn Ford, and I get to chair this session. And we have a special honor because Spencer's book that he will be speaking on won the Best Book Award yesterday. So we have a wonderful session ahead of us. Let me just introduce our speaker today. Spencer W. McBride is the Associate Managing Historian of the Joseph Smith Papers. He earned a PhD in history from Louisiana State University and is the author of multiple books on religion and American politics, including Pulpit and Nation, Clergymen and the Politics of Revolutionary America by University of Virginia Press, and Joseph Smith for President, the Best Book Award, The Prophet, The Assassins, and the Fight for American Religious Freedom. And we'll go ahead and get started with Spencer.
Well, good morning. It's early and it's Saturday. So I think you guys all get bonus points in the standings for being here so bright and early. I'm thankful to the program committee of the John Whitmer Historical Association for the invitation to speak, and for each of you for being here. And I'm particularly honored to do this on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of this organization. My topic, as you know, is Joseph Smith's 1844 presidential campaign, a campaign that he ran outside the two-party system and that had little to no chance of success. In 1844, these campaigns were referred to as independent campaigns, and these candidates, independent candidates. Today, we more commonly refer to them as third-party campaigns and third-party candidates. And over the course of American political history, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of third-party candidates. In fact, if you look in any presidential year, how many people have registered their candidacy for president, the number is in the hundreds every single year. And you've never heard of most of these people who paid the fee and filed. And on that long list, not a single candidate has ever come close to winning the presidency. Nowhere near it. And again, that list is long. Let me give you a few examples. Eugene Debs ran in 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920 as the candidate of the Socialist Party of America. In 1920, while he was incarcerated, he won nearly 1 million votes, totaling 3% of the electorate. Ralph Nader ran from a variety of different political parties in 1972, 1980, 1992, 1996, 2000, and 2008, and never did as well as Eugene Debs. Ross Perot is the most successful, perhaps, getting into the teens in his percentage of the popular vote. He famously played spoiler in the presidential elections of 1992 and 1996 as the Reform Party candidate. When I say stuff like this, if my father was here, he says, is it really history if I remember it? And I remember that. I was old enough. Then in 2020, Kanye West ran for president. And that's about all I'll say because I'm still trying to make sense of that one. And even with that short list, I'm not scratching the surface of all the examples of third-party campaigns. And amid any presidential campaign season, Americans debate the goals and wisdom of such long-shot, independent third-party candidates. Some point out that a third-party candidate can, at best, provide leverage to move one of the major parties' platforms to the left or to the right. Others point out the potential role of spoiler that these campaigns can play in a tight race, for better or for worse. Okay, I will say one more thing about Kanye West's campaign, because in 2020, that was one of the conversations in the media. Would Kanye West's, longshot bid hurt Donald Trump, or would it hurt Joe Biden? And the jury was out on that during the entirety of campaign season. But what if we look beyond the immediacy of elections? What if the real, lasting historical significance of these long-shot presidential campaigns has nothing to do with whether they would win or lose? Why should scholars, why should the general public pay attention to the history of campaigns that had no chance of winning? When we think of third-party campaigns and their significance solely through the lens of electoral success, when we write about third-party campaigns merely as historical trivia or fun facts, we miss what they can tell us about the state of the American public at any given time. For example, Eugene Debs with his 3%, historians have argued that in 1920 there were not 1 million communists in the United States. But what does it tell us about the discontent of 1 million Americans with the status quo that they would vote for a communist candidate who was incarcerated? So with that in mind, and the introduction at the beginning, the knowledge you have that I wrote a book about Joseph Smith's own independent presidential campaign, what does his campaign tell us about America? And I should probably, my wife says I should start this statement with spoiler alert: Joseph Smith doesn't win, just so you know. But his run for the presidency should not be relegated to the category of historical trivia, of fun facts. The story is not simply a little-known long-shot presidential campaign. And by invoking the third-party long-shot candidacies of other Americans such as Debs and Nader and Perot, I'm not comparing Joseph Smith's platform to these men's platforms, and I'm certainly not comparing Joseph Smith to Kanye West. What I am comparing is what these presidential campaigns run outside the two-party system tell us about American history, what they tell us about the discontent in a certain segment of the American populace at certain times, and why certain Americans believe at any given time that the solutions to their problems, that the solutions to the country's problems lie outside the mainstream, that the answers lie beyond the status quo. In this case, the story of Smith's 1844 bid for the presidency illuminates the discontent of some Americans, mostly Latter-day Saints, but not exclusively Latter-day Saints, in 1844. So what had Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints feeling so discontent about American politics, about American society? At the heart of that discontent was a history of repeated violent persecution that the Saints believed the political system of the United States condoned at least and enabled at worst. Now, I suspect that everyone in attendance is familiar with the long history of violent persecution of the Latter-day Saints, particularly in the 1830s and 1840s. But I'm going to repeat it all anyway. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to rehearse that. You guys know what we're talking about. But to understand the political complaint, the political discontent of Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints, there is one essential fact that must be distinctly understood. There is one fact of our civic memory that seems to be forgotten more than it is remembered, that if we don't know, no good can come from trying to understand Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. And the fact is this: prior to the American Civil War and the subsequent passage of the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. I'll say it again because it's really important. The federal government could not enforce the Bill of Rights on the individual states prior to the Civil War and the subsequent passage of the 14th Amendment. That was partly due to the prevailing constitutional interpretation of the time. If we go back to the framers of the Constitution and the first Congresses that adopted the Bill of Rights, their thinking was very much in the wake of the Revolutionary War. They thought, who is best empowered to protect the rights of the American people? The Revolution had been fighting, at least in theory, against a distant, almost foreign government of king and parliament. Well, the first Congresses in the United States, post-ratification, believed that the states were the best protectors of the people's rights, and that the greatest danger was a quote-unquote distant federal government. And so we understand their rationale. But compounding this constitutional interpretation was the prevalence of the states' rights doctrine, which, while being a legitimate view of federalism and governance, was also tied increasingly, as we get into the 1800s, to the protection of race-based slavery and protecting the institution of slavery from interference by the federal government. But this insistence on states' rights, this insistence that the states can protect the rights better than the federal government, and in fact that the states need to protect people's rights from the federal government, was also codified in law. In 1833, the Supreme Court case Barron v. Baltimore made waves when the when the Supreme Court explicitly stated what people were already thinking. And in the decision of Barron v. Baltimore, they stated the Bill of Rights does not apply to the individual states. Right there. And 1845, now I recognize that's a year after Joseph Smith's murder. 1845 in the case Permoli v. New Orleans. The Supreme Court rules specifically that the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment cannot be enforced upon the states by the federal government. This is law. And even after the 14th Amendment, again, a spoiler alert looking ahead, the Supreme Court does not consistently apply the freedom of religion clause found in the First Amendment to the states until the 1940s with the FDR administration. Such is the history of religious freedom in the United States. So why does this matter? Why do I insist that we as a group today understand this fact from our civic memory, this thing that was once commonly known and seems to be falling victim to our ever-worsening case of historical amnesia? It's because the Constitution, changing the Constitution on this point, constitutional reform on this very matter, is why Joseph Smith ran for president. But Joseph Smith was not a constitutional scholar. Joseph Smith was brilliant, but he was not one of the country's great legal minds. He was merely the leader of a religious minority group who recognized from his own lived experience that the Constitution, as much as he revered it, was falling short. That religious freedom in reality was a myth for religious minority groups. And this is the key tension of the story. And I would note that the others that are on this vanguard calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states, something that people got very excited about after the Civil War. But Joseph Smith is very early to it, but he's not alone. The other notable examples are the Shakers in New York. And if you know anything about the Shakers, they hold their community or their property as a community, and they believe in pacifism. And when New York State issued a militia tax for those that didn't serve in the state militia of $4 a man, they argued that it became a tax upon their religious community because of their pacifistic doctrines. And they made the case that the federal government should protect the Shakers from such persecution. And then, of course, that Supreme Court case we talked about in New Orleans v. Permoli. This is during an epidemic, and the city council is saying that the Catholic priests cannot hold open casket funerals and perform their ordinary Catholic funerary rites, and that case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, echoing in some ways legal challenges that have occurred in the last 2 years regarding public health policies and worship in public. So, as you know, I wrote this book on Joseph Smith's presidential campaign to make sense of the campaign, but also to contextualize the campaign. I knew in writing it that members of religious groups that trace their heritage and history to Joseph Smith would be interested. I knew that those that maybe knew Joseph Smith had run for president but always wondered why and wanted to know, did he have a chance, would be interested. But I also wrote and worked with my editors at Oxford to write it in a way that a general audience would care, keeping in my mind the entire time this question: why should somebody who does not care about Joseph Smith in a religious sense care about his presidential campaign that had no chance of winning? And to write that book, I had to write it in a narrative style with the analysis weaved in as seamlessly as possible. While having a PhD in history certainly helped me write the book, it was my intent to write a book that could be read and engaged with, no advanced degree in history required. I'll let you be the judges to the extent to which we succeeded. But I wrote it this way because Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, in my opinion, needs to be elevated from its status of curiosity or fun fact. It provides an indispensable lens through which to see the political obstacles to universal freedom. And so today I'm not going to rehearse every detail of the story. I mean, I kind of already told you how it ends. But hopefully I give you enough of the broad contours to walk away from this understanding the campaign and its significance to American history. Joseph Smith, in my opinion, was not a naturally political person. I spend my days on the Joseph Smith papers immersed in his documents. And what I see is a man who was sincere about his public professions, his religious teachings, who was drawn into politics out of necessity and out of desperation. Now, I know that's a common thing for politicians to say, right? Since America's beginning, politicians have tried to say, I'm not after the power, I'm just here to serve the people. And we know how that often turns out. But every now and then, I think we do have people that are pushed into politics out of desperation, and I really believe that Joseph Smith fits that bill. He was reluctant to engage in the federal political system. If he had his way, he would be left alone to worship and build the communities that enabled worship with his fellow Latter-day Saints. But of course, that was not in his cards. After the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from Missouri, Joseph Smith travels with Sidney Rigdon and Elias Higbee to Washington, D.C. to petition Congress for $2 million in redress and reparations. As you probably know, their petition was accompanied by hundreds of affidavits itemizing all the lost property in Missouri. Before they can meet with Congress, though, Joseph Smith and Elias Higbee knock on the White House door and are introduced in the president's parlor to President Martin Van Buren. But they're not alone. President Martin Van Buren held daily afternoon receptions where supplicants could come and meet and talk with him. And very different from White House politics today. And Joseph Smith and Elias Higbee had to get the president's attention. And as you probably know the story, they hand him a letter of introduction explaining the situation. And Van Buren says, "What can I do? I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I will come in contact with the state of Missouri." Now, later on, the same sentiments there, but the phrase gets turned into, "Gentlemen, your cause is just, but I can't do anything for you," or "I can do nothing for you." Essentially, Van Buren's saying, while I sympathize for your plight, if I help you, I will lose the state of Missouri in the upcoming presidential election, and it's going to be a tough one. Missouri is one of the only states I can depend on. Van Buren chose to do nothing. But what were they asking Van Buren to do? This was a time when executive orders from the president were rare, usually only issued in times of war, and very ineffective. That has changed. But if we look at all the Joseph Smith documents from that time and what they're writing back to Nauvoo, it's very clear what they were hoping Van Buren would do, that in his upcoming address to Congress, what we call today the State of the Union address, Joseph Smith and Elias Higbee were hoping that the president would mention their cause to Congress and encourage Congress to act. No such plea occurred, and they turned their attention to Congress. In the Senate, their memorial is presented, and Missouri tries to kill it on the spot. But eventually they're given a special hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee, not to determine whether or not they get the reparations, but to determine whether or not Congress has jurisdiction in the case. And after a 3-day special hearing, the committee unanimously votes that it has no jurisdiction in the case. And this is baffling to Joseph Smith. Not in part because, certainly in part because I think for average Americans at this time, understanding the ins and outs of federalism was difficult. Civic education's always been a top priority, but has often fallen short in teaching people how our government actually works. But ideologically, Joseph Smith and others said there is something wrong when a state can expel its citizens, a religious minority, under threat of extermination, and the federal government says we can do nothing for you. As much as Joseph Smith revered the Constitution, he's standing there thinking, this isn't right. This doesn't make sense. So he returns to Nauvoo, as you know, and he turns his attention to building a safe haven in the city of Nauvoo. But they continue to petition Congress. Year in and year out, they send a new petition to Congress and never get as far as they did in 1839 and 1840. By November 1843, they're still seeking reparations for what happened in Missouri. But things are getting bad in Illinois. It's looking in November 1843 like what happened in Missouri is going to happen again in Illinois. And so Joseph Smith writes a letter to each of the 5 men expected to run for the presidency: Lewis Cass, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Richard Mentor Johnson, and Martin Van Buren, asking each one, what will be your course of action toward the Latter-day Saints if you ascend to the executive's chair? Essentially implying, if we vote for you, how will you help us? Or if you say that you will help us, we will vote for you. And the Latter-day Saints were capable of at least delivering the electoral votes of the state of Illinois. Each man responds, 3 of the men respond, and they respond negatively, declining to help. Cass and Calhoun write essentially the same letter, declaring that while they sympathize for the Latter-day Saints, the states' rights doctrine is what prevents them from helping. That irritates Joseph Smith. He writes a lengthy rebuke of the states' rights doctrine in a public response to Calhoun. And this is just my opinion, but I think if there's one response that bothered Joseph Smith more than others, it was Henry Clay's. Because Henry Clay essentially gives the most politician answer ever. And nobody in American history has wanted to be president more than Henry Clay wanted to be president. He ran 5 times. Henry Clay essentially responded, I sympathize for you, but I want to go into the presidency without having any promises that I need to keep. So I'm not going to promise to help you. And this seems to really irk Joseph Smith. Again, it's just my opinion, reading between the lines, but I think Clay and Calhoun give a principled response. Joseph Smith vehemently disagrees with the principle, but at least there's a principle. Henry Clay gives a political answer. And of course, Richard Mentor Johnson and Martin Van Buren do not respond. So in January 1844, church leaders are counseling together, what are we going to do in the upcoming presidential election? They determined they should have an independent candidate with independent electors, essentially their own political party, and that candidate should be Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith accepts the nomination and gets to work on a political platform. One issue drove Joseph Smith into the presidential election of 1844. But Joseph Smith was not a one-issue candidate. Joseph Smith works with his clerk and confidant, William W. Phelps, and drafts a platform called General Smith's Views on the Powers and Policy of the Government of the United States. And that pamphlet is a document of radical political solutions to some of the most pressing problems the United States was facing. Joseph Smith calls for the end of slavery, either immediately or within 6 years. And he has an innovative solution. albeit ideologically problematic, it's a practical solution, which is the federal government will purchase the freedom of every enslaved man, woman, and child in the South. The federal government will purchase their freedom, and that will end slavery. And they will do it from the revenue generated from the sale of Western lands and from the reduction of the daily salary of congressmen that Joseph Smith was proposing. He calls for prison reform at a time when the country's brand new penitentiary system was rising up. Joseph Smith saw problems. As one who had been imprisoned before, not in a penitentiary, but in a jail, he sees problems. He sees a criminal justice system that increasingly punishes the poor while the wealthy have ways of getting out of it or getting around it. He also recognizes that the way that men and occasionally women were imprisoned and punished for their crimes did not reform them, but was so punitive as to portend a permanent criminal class in the country. He also calls for banking reform. And the national bank had been the hot button issue for 30 plus years in American history. And Andrew Jackson had recently killed the second bank of the United States. But he said, this bank's going to be different. We need it to stabilize our economy. But no one is going to get rich from the Bank of the United States. Those that run it will do it as public service for a per diem of $2. That's it. No one is going to get rich from the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States will serve the financial interest of society in stabilizing the economy. He calls for the territorial expansion of the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean, the annexation of Texas, claiming all of the disputed Oregon country, and eventually, as he states in the pamphlet, with the permission of the Native Americans, expansion into Canada and Central America. He also calls for shrinking the size of the federal government. He's been disillusioned by the workings of Congress. He's seen it in person. And this often happens in a 19th century American history. Those that live far away from the seats of power have some of you in mind of how the government works. And then they go and see for themselves and realize it doesn't work the way they thought it did. And Joseph Smith certainly fits this bill. And so he calls for reducing the size of Congress by half. But even as he calls to shrink the federal government, he's calling to give it more power. Because Joseph Smith, while not a one-issue candidate, had that one issue that got him into the race at all. And he calls for constitutional reform to empower the president and Congress to protect religious minorities from persecution when states failed to do so. And so Joseph Smith, working with the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, have an advantage that most independent candidates in 1844 did not have. What Joseph Smith had that others didn't have was an experienced corps of missionaries, men who knew how to leave home and travel without person script for lengthy periods of time to preach the gospel. And now they ask them to preach politics, to electioneer for Joseph Smith. And they canvass the country with Joseph Smith's political pamphlet in hand as a political tract. And they journeyed throughout the country campaigning for Joseph Smith. Now, some felt very comfortable speaking about politics. Lyman White, I think, was in his element to be out there doing this. And others didn't feel so comfortable preaching politics. And so what they did is they preached the gospel, believing that if they made a conversion, they also found a voter for Joseph Smith. And these 400 missionaries are out canvassing the country, planning to hold a convention in every single state and a national convention in Baltimore about the same time that the Democrats and Whigs would be holding theirs. So one of the questions that arises, was Joseph Smith serious? Was this just a publicity campaign? And Joseph Smith, through his scribe Willard Richards, answered a letter to one of their potential vice presidential nominees who asked essentially, is this a publicity stunt? Saying, we will benefit from I'm paraphrasing here, we will benefit from the publicity, but we intend to elect him. And how do I know that they were serious? To me, the biggest clue is the selection of electors. As you know, the way the American political system works in electing a president, the people do not elect the president directly. We vote for electors who then cast electoral votes. How many of you know the name of your state's electors in any presidential campaign that you have voted in? Okay, we have one. Maybe you were an elector in one of those two. No. But most of us don't, right? And so if it was just about publicity, why would you create the political infrastructure that nobody publicly pays attention to? The electors who cast electoral votes. No, there's a difference, though, in being serious about the campaign and thinking that with some form of divine intervention, Joseph Smith could win. And there's a difference between believing he would win. And I think there were many, including Joseph Smith himself, who acknowledged that his electoral prospects were slim. But if we really want to understand where this fits in the Latter-day Saints' political thinking, let's consider what they were doing at the exact same time. As Joseph Smith is running for president, the City Council of Nauvoo has petitioned Congress to make the city a federal territory comparable to Washington, D.C. Why would they do this? Because it gets them around the states' rights doctrine. If they are a federal city, the federal government is empowered to protect them from state-led persecution. So as Joseph Smith's running for president, as they're petitioning Congress to make Nauvoo a federal city, they also petition Congress to make Joseph Smith a general in the United States Army, to raise up a volunteer army of 100,000 men at a time when the standing army totaled 8,000 men, to protect those traveling on wagon trains into the Oregon country, and implied that if mobs came upon the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith could lead federal forces to protect his people. It was a way around states' rights. At the same time, there's another iron on the fire. Church leaders are petitioning Congress for a liberal tract of land in the Western territories where they could set up their own society in relative isolation from others. Again, federal territory, they believe, would lead to a way around states' rights. And they're talking about leaving the United States altogether at this time, moving to Texas, the Nueces Strip, and entering into secret preliminary negotiations with the president of the Republic of Texas, Sam Houston. So do you see the common theme here? Joseph Smith understands that there's bigotry in the country, that there's prejudice against him and his followers for their faith. But he also recognizes that there are political obstacles to universal religious freedom in the United States that on the surface have nothing to do with religion. On the surface, the states' rights doctrine has nothing to do with religious freedom. But Joseph Smith is observing, as the Shakers did and as the Catholics in New Orleans did, that when states become not the most reliable protectors of a religious minority's rights, but the most egregious offenders of the same, the federal government needs to be empowered to protect them, and the states' rights philosophy was prohibiting them from doing so. This is why Joseph Smith declared to the Nauvoo City Council, the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. They are a stink offering in the nostrils of Jehovah. Well, we know what happens. Amid the campaign season, things turn south in Nauvoo, with dissenters seeking to publish a newspaper critical of Joseph Smith and his practices. Joseph Smith ordering, in his capacity as mayor, the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor. The legal fallout from that, Joseph Smith is murdered in Carthage jail. Word gets out slowly to the electioneering missionaries. Sometimes I tell students and visitors who've never really thought, why in our accounts of Carthage jail are the only apostles around Willard Richards and John Taylor? Willard Richards was Joseph Smith's clerk and trusted scribe, and John Taylor needed to run the newspaper, among other tasks they had in Nauvoo. All the other apostles were out campaigning for Joseph Smith. And I think I write coyly in the book something like, there is no such thing as an ideal time to be murdered. But I can think of no worse time, considering the location of the leadership of the church, for the martyrdom of Joseph Smith to occur. Because they have to get word out to the apostles and to all these electioneering missionaries to return to Nauvoo. And in fact, the letter Willard Richards writes to Joseph Smith, to Brigham Young, says something, closes with a line along the lines of, the time for electioneering is over. Their candidate has died. When the Latter-day Saints do vote, they go for a dark horse candidate pretty overwhelmingly in Nauvoo, a man no one expected to be president, wasn't even on Joseph Smith's radar in writing those letters to prospective candidates in 1843, a man named James K. Polk. Now, if you talk to the people at the Polk papers, they will insist that Polk was not a dark horse candidate. I will qualify saying outside of the state of Tennessee, nobody thought Polk could be president. So in concluding, I want to ask the question, was Joseph Smith right that the states' rights doctrines were what fed mobs? And for your consideration, I want you to consider an event that happens 10 years later in 1854. In 1854, the state of Missouri was once again having problems with an unwanted minority group. But it wasn't Latter-day Saints. In 1854, their unwanted minority group was a political minority, the abolitionist. At a time when abolitionists and anti-slavery people were rushing to Kansas and Nebraska in an effort to sway the state of slavery to make it legal or illegal in those respective states, they were spilling it across the borders into Missouri. And in Missouri, which was a slave state, they were agitating for the end of slavery. What would the pro-slavery leaders of the state do to quell the disruption of these abolitionists? Well, we can look to a letter that sitting Senator David Atchison of Missouri wrote to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Yes, that Jefferson Davis. And for those that maybe don't remember, David Atchison was one of the militiamen that helped persecute the Latter-day Saints in the Missouri War in the 1838s, and he's now risen to the state of United States Senator. And this is what he writes to Jefferson Davis to tell him how they are going to solve the abolitionist problem in Missouri. Quote, "We are organizing to meet their organization. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang. But the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionist." We intend to Mormonize the abolitionist. A sitting United States senator turned the word Mormon into a verb that meant burn, shoot, and hang unwanted minority groups. And he brazenly wrote about doing so to the U.S. Secretary of War. Why did he feel comfortable doing so? I'm speculating here, but in the 1830s, that is exactly how the state had handled the Latter-day Saints. They burned, they shot, they hung. They did more than that. They raped, they stole. And they had gotten away with it. When the Latter-day Saints told the federal government what Missouri had done, the United States government said, "We can do nothing for you." So in 1854, faced with another group, their past behavior condoned by the federal government, they determined they will do the same thing. So in 1854, at least, the states' rights doctrine really did feed mobs. So in conclusion, wrapping up, when we talk about the political obstacles to universal religious freedom in 19th century America, as well as in the present, we are not merely talking about a list of overtly discriminatory laws or public policies or philosophies of governance. We are also talking about the way Americans use seemingly neutral policies, seemingly neutral laws to enact and maintain discrimination against minority groups. Some do so out of ignorance. They're unaware of the way that their political devotion abridges the rights of some of their fellow citizens. Some do it to defend inaction, as a way of claiming that their hands are tied when they don't really want to expend the effort or political capital to help an unpopular group. But still others sometimes use these seemingly neutral laws as a thin veil covering their prejudice against one religious minority group or another. Joseph Smith ran for president because he recognized this problem. He fought religious bigotry, but he knew that the fight for universal religious freedom was more than a fight against religious bigots. The fight was also against the systems of governance that empowered and ultimately protected such bigotry. Through his candidacy, Joseph Smith promoted the idea that as important as rooting out prejudice and misunderstanding was to his cause, Americans would never experience true universal religious freedom until they could also address the flaws in their laws and government that maintained such systemic inequality. Joseph Smith ran for president because he was desperate to protect his people and their rights. Joseph Smith ran for president because he understood that without constitutional change, this was not going to occur in his lifetime. Thank you.